Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Greetings and welcome to another episode of Canadian History X. You know, when we think of women in the Second World War, we often think of them working in foundries, or putting bolts on planes, or serving in a variety of different roles. And I'm actually going to go to a National Film Board video that kind of shows how people saw women in the workforce during the Second World War. This video was made in 1946 and it's called To the Ladies. I'm going to play a very brief clip of it.
In '39, I believed war was a man's job, until I saw women in uniform. 45,000 wrens, quacks, and WDs. Skeptically, I thought, the romance of a uniform. But they rolled up their sleeves and pitched into an amazing assortment of jobs. And as they took over these duties, many of them dull, dirty, and monotonous, they released men for frontline fighting. Then there was the farm front. Kids I'd seen playing the jukebox had gone out of the drugstores and into the fields. They picked fruit and pulled vegetables. They were burnt and blistered and full of kinks, but they stuck to the job. And farm women who had always worked hard now worked twice as hard with half the help. I said to my daughter-in-law, it can't last. I wondered why she smiled. Then industry gave a sort of national wolf whistle. I said women wouldn't pay any attention, but they came from all over Canada. By thousands, they poured from the railway stations. By tens of thousands, they signed on the payrolls of Canadian war plants. They heaved heavy shells along the assembly lines. Hands trained to sew a fine seam threaded their way through intricate machinery. Like most skeptics, I looked a lot before I believed a little. With nothing but flimsy gauze between their pretty faces and sudden death, they loaded shell detonators. And in scientific research, without a flutter, they even handled rats. In shipyards, I saw mamas toss red-hot rivets as accurately as pancakes and handle the riveting gun as ably as the next guy. I was still a skeptic. But common sense told me not to laugh out loud. And I used to think shipyards were sacred to men. It seemed those days I couldn't get away from women. They carried my bags and even drove the buses on our route. Sure, these were essential services. But even the horse seemed surprised at first. Oh, well, I had a lot to learn.
Now, the reason that I played that clip was because I had the wonderful pleasure of interviewing Sandra Battaglini. And Sandra wrote a thesis called Don't Go Down the Mine, Mama, Women at INCO During World War II. Now, the INCO mines in Sudbury were of a vital importance to the war effort, and as Sandra will point out, they actually helped both sides of the war effort before and during the war. Before the war, the nickel helped to build the German war machine, and then during the war, it helped to build the Allied war machine to fight the Germans. So that's a really interesting angle towards it. But she did this thesis on the women who began working in the mines, or not in the mines, but at least at the mines in Sudbury. And it was a fascinating read, and it was really interesting to learn this history because we don't often think about women working at mines when we think of the Second World War and the role that women played in it. So we're going to go to the interview with Sandra right now. First question is kind of what got you interested in writing your thesis on the INCO mining women?
Well, so when I was in my master's year, like the first year was, coursework, and then we... Originally, I wanted to do my thesis on post-World War II Italian immigrant workers because my father was one. Mm-hmm. But my supervisor at the time said, start looking into the employee files from the 1940s, because if we're going to look post-World War II, we want to be able to offer the context, of the decade before. So when I started looking at the files, I started seeing all these women, and I was like, what are these women doing here? First I was seeing Italian women, right?
Yeah.
And then there was a visiting professor from Université Montréal, Bruno Ramirez, who's a very, well-known labor historian. And he came to speak to, coach the master students about their theses. And so when he came, he was like, and I told him what I was working on. He's like, you need to focus on the women, because it was a much more like, sort of story. There was a beginning, middle, and end, because, it was when the War Measures Act came, they temporarily suspended, obviously all legislation, and introduced an order in council that allowed women to go work underground. Not actually underground, because they never went underground, but allowing women to work at a mine, because it was illegal for women to work at a mine except in a clerical or domestic capacity.
Mm-hmm.
So then it was just like, then I basically spent, several months, at the INCO archives, gathering all of the employee information. And then I got to interview and meet them, like, several of them. So it was just honestly one of the best experiences of my life,
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I kind of noticed in reading your thesis was, like, you mentioned Rosie the Riveter and all these other common, like when you see images of women in the Second World War working, they're, putting bolts on planes, things like that. And so do you feel like women in mining, even though mining was such an important industry during the war, do you feel like women in mining were overlooked when we kind of look back on women in the workforce back then?
Oh, absolutely. It was as though they were disregarded. The thing about mining, it was the most blatant example of temporarily bringing women into the workforce. And then when the war ended, the order in council was suspended or returned, and women were no longer allowed to work at a mine until the late 70s. So when, a lot of the, historians talk about that time period, they say, this was a temporary initiative, and in no way, according to some historians, in no way represented a meaningful entry or like a, women's participation in the workforce, because it was for such a short time. But so definitely, like, no one had up until that point really looked at women working in the mining industry. And in fact, it was so significant. Mining was so significant, nickel mining, because it was, deemed a war priority metal,
mm-hmm.
and all the other mines were closed, like all the other gold mines were closed around, and because it was, because it was an essential material, men could opt out of going to fight, and they could actually stay and work at the mine. So. Mm-hmm. And that nickel was literally, I mean, I don't know if you know this, and this is something that's not really, I mean, you might find one or two things on the internet, but basically, because INCO was an American company, that nickel that they produced literally fed Hitler's war machine and militarized, them with, so that's like, and Sudbury became rich because of it.
Yeah.
So it's like a little known fact. It's like, for some, I'm not saying for some reason, obviously there's reasons why it's not well known, but, I've been tampering with a screenplay for a long time about this, about women's participation mm-hmm. there. But yeah, it's such a fascinating, like, I was in the, at the archives in Ottawa poring over the large ledger books that showed, that how many, it's in my thesis too, and I might misquote myself because I haven't read it in a while, but how many millions of tons of nickel went to Hitler. Like, I saw it in the ledger books myself. So,
really?
Yeah. So it's like seeing that, you're like, wait a minute, this is insane. And then, after the war, Sudbury was like this, was rich, because it was producing all this stuff for the war. And then it ended up being like, the site of, major labor movement, like one of the most, violent labor movements around mm-hmm. because of it. Because, during, I I met a woman who was secretly organizing for the mine mill union. So INCO had introduced their own union. I can't remember what they were called, but during the war, this one woman in particular, she secretly signed up people to join mine mill. And that was the union that, they of course said that it was a communist Marxist union, which, I mean, in all intents and purposes, sure. You know what I mean? But like, that was the union that became, the union after the war.
And you kind of mentioned it here, and it was something I found really interesting in the thesis. Like you said, women were forbidden from certain mine jobs. There was all these rules for women, like a matron had to be employed for any group of women. If there was 12 or more, women couldn't clean or oil any moving machinery part. And then also that they couldn't go into the mine, and I guess was a big part of that just this weird superstition that a woman in the mine was bad luck.
Yeah, I know. It's so funny. Those like, examining the company records and the government documents, and then, looking at all the, media and correspondence or like advertising, like describing to the public what was going on. Yeah, it was like, they infantilized women. They treated them the same way that they treated teenage boys when they brought teenage boys into the workforce at INCO. Is very much the same. Obviously they stopped doing that which was one of the reasons why they brought women in, was because, they could no longer employ young boys at the mine, So, but when you look at some of the the articles that they had, in the Sudbury Star, it's like, I don't know if you saw that, but it's like, hey, look at this person. She's operating this machine. It's like she's operating an ice cream machine. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like because they were so preoccupied they wanted to ensure the public that in no way were women taking men's jobs. And that was a big deal. So they wanted to make sure that was not what people understood, and that this was just temporary and these women were just filling in. Yeah. And they treated them like very obviously they, the fact that they had the matrons, which, God, that was very important to have those at the time. But yeah, the way that they treated them, the way they talked about them was, very, obviously, what's the word? What's that P word?
Patronizing.
Yes. Yeah.
And I guess kind of related to that, you had a really good quote from a Maria B. where she says, "I worked a quarter a day, $15 a month. I know hard work." I'm talking about housework. And so, like you said, it kind of treated the women like they were almost infants working. But, these women have had worked hard jobs like, cleaning houses and things like that for hours and hours a day. And do you feel like the women coming in, like they were ready for that kind of work? Like they wanted to prove the people in the community and the company wrong, that, they could do more than what the company and the community and the newspapers and things like that were kind of saying they could do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they just felt the call. Like when I actually sat down and talked to them, then I understood it differently. People don't the women didn't see necessarily those gender divisions or being or the way that at the time they might have not interpreted it that way, but they were ready to participate and were so happy to participate. And, some of the women said that it was the best time of their lives. So yeah, housework was pretty much what women did before the war in Sudbury, because Sudbury, for all intents and purposes, in the earlier years was predominated mostly by men, because men were coming in to work at the mine. And so it was very much a male-dominated town. And then, obviously men started to, settle, and then women, and, the women came, but it was like, this is a man's town, These early settlements that were resource-driven, because Sudbury was discovered. I mean, Sudbury became Sudbury because they discovered nickel while they were building the railroad, 1880s. So that's how it all started. And, yeah.
Did women come from many different areas, like not just in Sudbury, but kind of from all over Ontario to work in the mines or at the mines?
All over Canada. All over Canada. Yeah.
And I guess you kind of touched on this, but within the community, how was it seeing women working at the mine? Like, how did the community of Sudbury kind of I don't know if they embraced it, but like, how was it seen overall?
Well, I think that it was just a point of pride for a lot of people. In the newspapers, they just wanted to ensure that, women weren't taking over their jobs. And, truthfully, even when I spoke to some of the women, they were like, yeah, we didn't want to we wanted the men to come home.
Yeah.
And but when the war ended and then they were let go, they were, a lot of them talk about how they cried a lot and they wished that they could have continued working there, so that's what makes this experience so different from other, war industries like, munitions factories and, bomb factories, which are the same, and auto and airplane manufacturers, because women did stay on afterwards because they would do things like upholstery and all that kind of stuff. But at INCO, it was like, that was it. And so it was, because, and that has a lot to do with the fact that mining, hard rock mining is a very male job, or at least like because even now, you're not going to find that many women underground. When I was doing my master's, I got a tour, the smelter. We went like 3,500 feet underground, which I would never do again because the thought of that, I can't even believe I did it, but underground. And then just going that deep, and you go and it's just like, men, like they touched the ground and the ceiling. Like they were that huge, these were massive drills, and, they just had the light on their helmets, and it was like, oh, this does not feel great, but because it was a lot of strength was needed for that kind of work, those same men were needed to be in the war effort. Like, it was the same kind of, person that they were looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, it was, it's kind of like the similarities between what's happened then and what's going on now the parallels are really similar in so many ways, because it was a complete readjustment of society, for the war effort. Which is what the Green New Deal advocates talk about, and then what almost accidentally is happening now. It's like the society is completely readjusting for this new, for what's happening, and which is really mostly because of climate change. But it's like this total reorganization of our economies, of our societies, and it's very similar. It's really astounding.
Absolutely. And reading through the thesis, it mentions that women could be let go for a variety of reasons, including pregnancy, getting married, things like that. And the majority of the women worked less than 6 months. I guess not majority. I think it was like 39% or something. But why did you find that most women did work for kind of such a short period of time?
I think that it was because, like, in 1942, that's when Canada entered the war effort. And so it was like, that's when Canada was like, okay, now we need to reorganize the society to support this war effort. So it was like, it was all in waves. So, the first wave of like, okay, we need X amount of women to do this work. And I think that's why the time of work was short, because it all just happened in, spurts. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It was like, the war effort starts, okay, let's usher in these women, and, and then, a lot of them too were like, a lot of the women were like single women too, you know what I mean? Yeah. And I guess, so, I think it was just because, like, they just, over 42, so 3 years, it was just like, they just brought in women at different times, depending on the demand, you know what I mean? And as the war, kept going, then the demand increased. And so, that's why you see sort of fluctuations in length of employment.
In regards to the matrons, in reading the thesis, it seemed like there was some distrust of matrons by the women who were working at the mine. Was it a case of the matrons were kind of serving as that link between mine management and the women, or was that just because they were the women in charge and no different than guys looking at a supervisor? That's the corporate guy, he's working for the other guys, he's not part of us. Yeah, was it kind of the same thing, or like I said, was it just that person, they're in charge so they can't possibly be on our side?
Yeah, absolutely. It was just, and also because this matron was like, what exactly was the matron? It was like a baby. It was, it was a supervisor for women, with that very, we just said that word, patronizing attitude toward them. So I think that, like you look at even just the way that they treated them was not, it wasn't in a equal way. It's not like, they just looked down on them and treated them, in a sort of second class way. You know what I mean? So I think it was just the nature of ushering women into this place that was dominated by men. So how are we going to manage that? And, there was all sorts of great stories about, like, there was this one woman was she called the Ball of Fire? Anyways, apparently she'd have sex with a bunch of men, and then she had chlamydia, so that's why they called her the Ball of Fire. And was it the Ball of Fire? Oh my God, I need to reread.
I think it was.
Yeah, that was the best. Like, the stories were the best. I mean, and I interviewed mostly women of Italian descent, because, that's who I focused on. And, I interviewed a couple of non-Italian women, but these women, what was amazing about these women was, like, the first time I met them, we met at the church in Coppercliff, and they were, like, in their 80s. And here's a group of women who grew up together in this small, company town. And, the part of that Italian community that, during World War II were deemed enemies of the country,
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a lot of that going on, but just I think that in that community, especially, you had, like, an inner supervision going on. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, everyone knew each other. So the workers, like, they knew that someone was always looking after them and out for them. And also, like, I'm going to spy on you. And if you do anything, I'm going to tell your parents, It
did seem kind of like they were making the matron like a babysitter over the women, and like you said, in a very patronizing way. It wasn't a supervisor, it was just somebody to kind of watch them. And I found the matron thing very interesting.
Yeah, it really is. It's so true. And I think it's just, it's that thing of, like, the person who stands between you and management and, has this idea that, like, whatever, of superiority, and so on. So I think, like, it's just such an interesting story.
Absolutely. And I guess my last question is, like you said, the women worked for, I think, a maximum of about 3 years, and then the war was done. And then, unlike other industries, it was, okay, men are back at the mine, women aren't working there anymore. But looking in the long term, what role did the women play in helping change labor laws, do you feel, across Canada, just by the efforts that they put in working at the mines?
It's hard to tell. It's just that it took until the late 70s for women to actually go underground. So,
it seems like the mine really kind of lagged behind a lot of other industries.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because, like, some people would say, well, the war effort, sparked the feminist movement. You know what I mean? And,
Mm-hmm.
and really, I mean, I think it's fair to say that was the case in a lot of ways, because, like, here are women, during this time of crisis doing non-traditional work, and then, and then being let go, or, like, obviously, even in the munitions factories, a lot of women were let go, but a lot of women stayed on in different capacities, and working in that industrial in the industrial complex, of course, definitely moved, the idea of like women's participation, equality of women's work. I think in Sudbury, what's really significant though was the creation of the mine mill union. So I think that definitely had so much to do with women's labor force participation and rights of workers. Maybe not right after the war, like it was mostly men but the women were fighting with their men to get better working conditions. Because, if you look back from when INCO started, the late 1800s, even and before the war, the conditions were terrible, and then after the war, mine mill unions happened. And then, Sudbury, the workers in Sudbury became the best paid workers in the world. The miners there became the best paid workers in the world. And that definitely contributed to, better work conditions for women inevitably. You know what I mean? But specifically at the mine, it didn't materialize until the late 70s, but it was like, in a one industry town, those things are difficult, right?
Yeah.
Like diverse labor force participation is very difficult, because when you have a mine, I mean, and this is obviously the problem often in Canada, but Sudbury was just an extraction. That was just an extraction industry. So it was just primary and secondary manufacturing. Like you took out the the nickel and the ore and the copper, and then you processed it, and then you shipped it out. So which is literally has so much to do with our relationship with the United States. So if they would have developed a tertiary industry in Sudbury around the manufacturing of things, Sudbury wouldn't have experienced the shocks that it did over time. Like my dad worked at INCO, the whole, for my whole life until he retired. And I mean, there were layoffs and there were strikes. So the town always experienced the shock of wherever that company, whatever it experienced, the town experienced, And so for women in particular, employment was definitely, there were minimal places that women could participate, and that obviously that's changed now because Sudbury is a much more, has a lot more, sectors, but really now it's, Vale, which is the mining company from Brazil. But if they stopped mining in INCO, in Sudbury, I wonder what would be left there. What would Sudbury be if? And Sudbury saw a boom just like maybe in the last 15 years or more because of China. Yeah. And the need for nickel to power that massive industrial experiment. That's all just crashed. Thank God. Because it's like, if the women were not brought in, I mean, what would they have done? This was such a significant moment, obviously, and in a town like Sudbury, and especially, this is what I want to bring up now is just, I want to, share the story of, the fact that this was the site of Hitler's war machine. I'm sure there were multiple sites, but this one was a big one. And you're like, oh, but weren't we on the Allied side? So, I just love that stuff. And, basically I am trying to meld in a few stories on the screenplay because one of the women that, one of the stories I found most fascinating was, I'm in the employee files and, I see there's this woman, who, starts working at INCO. She has a child and a husband, but he's deceased. He's passed away. And then I find his employee file and, cause of death, I guess it was I can't remember the exact terminology. It would be in my thesis. But he dies at the smelter. Then I meet her. Okay. And that was just amazing. And she said that basically, so this one morning, their daughter's 2 and he's going off to work. This is during the war. And he's going off to work and he kisses them goodbye. And then he turns back around and does it again. She's like, that was unusual. And then 20 minutes later, they call and say that he fell into like one of the vats.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, and that was it. So, that's the other thing too. It's like and then there was one woman whose arm was taken off because her arm got caught on one of the conveyors. I know. So, the war transformed the war significantly transformed worker rights and working conditions at the mine.
Yeah.
So, you know what I mean? And those stories, that's why, and so I wanted to amalgamate her story with the woman who started canvassing for the mine mill union. So, the premise is she, this woman loses her husband, and then because the working conditions were poor, and then starts to secretly organize, and and that's kind of the story there.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Canadian History X and that interview with Sandra. And if you did, please support the podcast by going to Patreon at patreon.com/CanadaX. You can also email me any questions you have at craig@canadax.com. And you can find hundreds of articles on my website, all about Canada's history, at canadax.com. Thanks, and we'll see you again next time.